Jasmine Crockett versus Ken Paxton, the battle for justice. When Paxton, Texas' powerful attorney general, publicly calls Crockett despicable, it sparks a firestorm that threatens to ruin her career. But instead of backing down, Jasmine sues Paxton for defamation, determined to expose the corruption lurking in the highest offices of Texas. As the case unfolds, secrets begin to unravel, revealing not just Paxton's misdeeds but the powerful network that enabled them. With $1 million in damages on the line and Paxton's career hanging by a thread, will justice be served? What happens when the truth is too dangerous to keep hidden? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. At precisely 9:47 a.m., on what should have been a quiet Texas morning, the official X account of Attorney General Ken Paxton dropped a single sentence that would dominate the next 3 news cycles. Jasmine Crockett is despicable. No thread, no explanation, no clarification. Just 7 words posted publicly from one of the most powerful legal offices in the country. Words aimed squarely at a sitting congresswoman, a black woman, and a rising political force who had, only days earlier, criticized Governor Greg Abbott's controversial migrant relocation policy in a Los Angeles speech. What followed wasn't silence. It was an explosion. Within minutes, conservative influencers latched onto the post, hailing Paxton as a man of courage who called out radicalism with no filter. On talk radio across Texas, callers cheered. Fox News hosts grinned knowingly, framing the comment as harsh but fair. But elsewhere, on community boards, across university campuses, in congressional circles, the tone was entirely different. What millions saw wasn't a statement of disagreement. It was a public official using his platform to shame, target, and diminish a woman of color for speaking truth to power. Lawyers noted the legal risks. Civil rights groups called it a blatant abuse of position. But for many ordinary Americans, it struck a deeper nerve. It reminded them how swiftly a woman, especially a black woman, can be dragged and discredited when she steps too far outside the line society quietly draws. Jasmine Crockett didn't respond, not right away. She didn't log on to clap back. She didn't hold a press conference with fire and fury. She just went quiet. And in that silence, cable hosts speculated. Colleagues texted her. Some allies worried she'd let it slide. But what they didn't know, what Ken Paxton definitely didn't understand, was that silence for Jasmine wasn't surrender. It was strategy. 3 days later, she emerged, not behind a podium, but walking slowly into a packed Capitol media room with a manila folder in her hand and clarity in her voice. "I've read the tweet," she began. "I know what he meant, but more importantly, I know why he said it, and I won't let that go unanswered." She didn't scream. She didn't insult him back. She laid out facts. Her team had gathered legal evidence showing that the comment wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thought, but part of a documented pattern of public antagonism aimed at silencing female lawmakers who oppose the state's agenda. She referenced Texas civil codes, state employee conduct policies, and prior public misconduct complaints filed against Paxton's office. And then came the line that reshaped the story. "This lawsuit is not about reputation. It's about power and who gets to use it without consequence." The room held its breath. For a full 10 seconds, not a single journalist moved. And in that stillness, something cracked, not just in the court of public opinion, but in the armor of men who believed they could insult, defame, and bully without cost. Paxton had fired a shot, but Jasmine had fired back, with the law. The aftermath of Jasmine's press conference was thick with the kind of tension that could only be described as explosive. She just declared war, both on Ken Paxton and on the corrupted system he represented. But her words were only the first salvo. Now came the real battle, and it wasn't going to be fought with headlines alone. Jasmine knew that silence wasn't an option any longer. Paxton's tweet calling her despicable wasn't just an attack on her, it was a direct assault on every woman in Texas who had ever dared to stand up to the powerful. And it was time to hit back, not just for her own honor, but for the honor of every person silenced, erased, and ignored by Paxton's manipulation. The very next morning, she called a meeting, a closed-door strategy session with her top legal advisors and key civil rights activists. The room was heavy with the weight of what they were about to take on. Lawyers and strategists sat in sharp silence, knowing they were not just preparing for a legal battle, they were preparing for a fight that could shift the political landscape forever. Jasmine entered the room, her gaze unwavering. She knew she had to be both calm and resolute. She wasn't just up against a man who'd wronged her. She was up against a system that had been rigged to protect him, a system where power, privilege, and manipulation had been his tools of choice. And Jasmine wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been bullied, threatened, and silenced by figures like Paxton. She was fighting for every woman of color who had been dismissed, degraded, or belittled simply because they dared to speak up. "We're not talking about just one tweet," Jasmine began, her voice cutting through the tension. "We're talking about years of Ken Paxton using his office to retaliate against anyone who stands against him. Years of him using his platform to destroy reputations, intimidate those who oppose him, and manipulate public opinion. And that stops now." A civil rights attorney at the table spoke up, his voice grave. "Jasmine, we've been digging into Paxton's past actions. It's not just you. He's done this to others. This isn't just a defamation case. It's a pattern of abuse and power manipulation that spans across the state of Texas." Another voice, that of a former activist who had been on the receiving end of Paxton's power, spoke with quiet intensity. "You're right. He's weaponized his office against people like us for years. Black women, women of color, activists who stand against him. He doesn't just attack people's ideas. He attacks them personally, viciously. He wants to make sure we never speak out again." The room fell into a deep silence. The reality of what Jasmine was about to do was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just a matter of personal pride or professional reputation. This was about dismantling the abusive system that Paxton had used for years to terrorize those who dared to question him. And Jasmine wasn't going to let him get away with it, not anymore. Jasmine's voice broke through the silence, now calm but forceful. "I'm going to file a lawsuit, but not just any lawsuit. I'm filing a civil suit against Paxton for defamation, sure. But more than that, I'm filing this lawsuit because Ken Paxton is using his power to silence people, and especially women. He's used his platform to systematically attack women of color who speak out, and I'm going to make sure the world knows about it. We'll bring the evidence into the light, and we're going to make him answer for it." She let her words hang in the air for a moment. The room was still. She could see the determination in her team's eyes, the fire that was igniting in their hearts. But there was no time for hesitation. This fight wasn't going to wait. "We're going to make this a landmark case," Jasmine continued, her voice firm and unwavering. "This isn't just about clearing my name. It's about setting a precedent. We need to show everyone who's ever been attacked by powerful people that they have a voice that they can fight back. We need to expose the lengths Paxton has gone to in order to maintain his power, and we need to do it publicly. This is bigger than me. This is about every person who's been crushed under the weight of his abuse." As she spoke, Jasmine could feel the energy in the room shift. What started as a simple legal response had evolved into a fight for justice that was far greater than she had anticipated. This wasn't just a lawsuit. This was a chance to expose a corrupt system and bring accountability to the most powerful office in Texas. Her legal team went to work immediately, drafting the lawsuit and gathering all the evidence they could find. But Jasmine wasn't just focused on the paperwork. She knew that this fight was going to be won in the court of public opinion as much as in the courtroom. She was going to make sure every Texan knew the truth. And when it was all over, when Paxton was finally held accountable for his actions, Jasmine Crockett would stand as the symbol of defiance, the one person who refused to stay silent, the one who said, "Enough." The battle lines were drawn, and for Jasmine Crockett, there was no turning back now. The moment Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the press conference, the impact of her words hung in the air, thick and undeniable. She hadn't just spoken out against Ken Paxton. She had made it clear that she was going to hold him accountable for the system of power he had weaponized against so many. Her decision to file the lawsuit wasn't just an act of personal defense. It was a direct challenge to the entrenched power structures that allowed corruption and manipulation to thrive unchecked. And as the press conference concluded, the storm began. Within hours, headlines exploded across every major news outlet. Jasmine Crockett sues Texas Attorney General for $1 million over defamation. Paxton faces legal action after Crockett lawsuit over public insult. The words were everywhere, spilling into every conversation, turning Jasmine from a rising political star into a symbol of resistance. The press didn't just cover the lawsuit, they dissected it. It wasn't just about a public slur. It was about an entire system of abuse and retaliation. But it wasn't just the press coverage that lit the fire. It was Paxton's own words. When he spoke to reporters, his response was designed to be defiant, to double down on his position. "I will not apologize. I said what I said, and I stand by it," he declared with a cold, almost arrogant certainty. He had expected his words to shut her down, to silence the conversation with a show of unyielding confidence. But instead, his response only fueled the flames. That very clip, "I stand by it," was replayed across social media, paired with Jasmine's powerful declaration, "This lawsuit is about setting a precedent." The clip went viral. His defiance became his undoing. As the clip circulated, the backlash against Paxton grew. His words weren't the rallying cry he thought they would be. They were a stark reminder of his disregard for accountability. And it wasn't just the media calling him out. A groundswell of support surged behind Jasmine. Women's groups, civil rights organizations, former employees, many of whom had been silenced by Paxton's influence, began to speak out. Their voices flooded the narrative, and they weren't holding back. The Texas Women's Coalition issued a statement of support, declaring that Paxton's actions were not an isolated incident. They were part of a larger pattern of systematic abuse and disregard for the rights of those who challenged him. National groups like NOW, National Organization for Women, voiced their support, while former employees who had been pushed out of Paxton's office began to share their stories. These weren't just people who had heard rumors or whispered about Paxton's behavior in private. They had lived it. They had been the targets of his personal vendettas, smeared, dismissed, and discarded simply because they had spoken out or resisted his agendas. The media began to piece together the stories of those who had been silenced. Not just Jasmine, but a long list of victims of Paxton's unchecked power. It was no longer just about one woman's defamation suit. It was a reckoning for the people who had been crushed under Paxton's reign of intimidation. Every news story that surfaced was a stitch in the fabric of a growing movement. Jasmine wasn't just standing for herself anymore. She was standing for every person who had been silenced, for every woman who had been told to shut up, for every activist who had been shut down. Jasmine's decision to pursue the lawsuit wasn't just about clearing her name. It was a deliberate, powerful move to expose the abuse of power and the misuse of a political office that had gone unchecked for far too long. The truth wasn't just in the headlines. It was in every word spoken by those who came forward to stand with her. The fight wasn't hers alone anymore. It was theirs too. And as the waves of support continued to swell, Jasmine knew one thing for certain. This fight wasn't just for justice. It was for the future of Texas politics. She was not just challenging Paxton. She was challenging a culture of corruption, a culture that had spent far too long turning a blind eye to the abuse of power. Now the world was watching, the truth was out, and there was no turning back. The night had fallen, but inside the law office, the lights burned bright as Jasmine's legal team gathered around the long oak table, each of them poring over stacks of documents, their faces etched with fatigue and determination. The weight of the task ahead felt heavier now. They had already gathered evidence. They had already prepared their case. But Jasmine knew, as did her team, that this wasn't just about winning a lawsuit. It was about exposing the rot that ran deep in the very office Paxton had used to wield power over others. The clock ticked steadily in the background, but time seemed to slow down as the team carefully reviewed a particular file. It was a leak from a previous investigation, an old but significant piece of evidence that had been tucked away, overlooked by many until now. One of the junior attorneys, Lisa, flipped through the pages, and as she paused, her eyes widened. She leaned in and pointed at a paragraph on the screen. "Look at this," she said. "This could be the break we need." Jasmine stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her eyes scanned the page with laser focus. The report detailing an investigation into Nate Paul, the real estate mogul tied to Paxton, was far more damning than they had originally thought. The details were chilling. Paxton, through his office, had intervened on Paul's behalf multiple times, using his political influence to shut down investigations and derail legal action against Paul. What stood out, however, was one particular section that described a pattern of intimidation, a tactic Paxton had used not just to protect Paul's interests, but to destroy anyone who dared to challenge or expose him. The report outlined a system of political retaliation, not just against rivals, but against anyone who could cause trouble for Paxton or his allies. The tactics were clear: public humiliation, legal threats, and the abuse of power to silence critics. And now, looking at the cold, hard facts, it became obvious to Jasmine. The attack Paxton had launched against her wasn't just a random insult. It was part of a broader pattern of political retribution. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table, and she exhaled sharply. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about one tweet, one insult, or one moment of public humiliation. This was a calculated move, a move meant to put her back in her place, to remind her that no one, especially a woman of color, should ever dare to stand up to someone like Paxton. The abuse of power wasn't just personal, it was institutional. She stood up from her seat, the chair scraping loudly against the floor as she faced her team. The energy in the room shifted immediately. The team could feel it, the anger, the resolve, the certainty that this was bigger than anything they had imagined. Jasmine's voice broke the silence, low but firm. "We're not suing just to protect my reputation," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. "We're suing because this isn't just about me. It's about every person Paxton has attacked, every woman he's humiliated, and every person who's been silenced by his abuse of power. It's about setting a precedent, because if we don't do this now, this will keep happening, and it's time it ended." Her words landed heavy in the room, and for a moment, no one spoke. They didn't need to. Jasmine had just made it clear. This wasn't just a lawsuit. This was a fight for justice, for every person who had been crushed by the powerful without ever having the chance to fight back. Jasmine turned to her lead counsel, her eyes never leaving the evidence before her. "We have what we need," she said. "The truth is here, and now we're going to make sure the world knows what Paxton really is. We're not just taking on a man, we're taking on a corrupt system, and we're going to make sure this never happens again." Her team nodded, and in that moment, they understood the stakes. This wasn't just about one man's abuse of power. It was about dismantling the system that protected him, about making sure that the cycle of intimidation and silence was broken once and for all. As Jasmine turned to leave, she felt the weight of the journey ahead. But she also knew one thing. This fight wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, to everyone who had ever been forced to endure the cruelty of the powerful with no voice to fight back. And she would make sure that their voices were heard, loud and clear. The day of the trial had arrived. The courtroom was filled with tension, the air thick with anticipation. Ken Paxton, dressed in a dark suit that matched the arrogance in his eyes, strode into the room with his legal team by his side. His movements were deliberate, slow, and each step seemed to echo with the certainty that, in his mind, this would be another battle he would win. His face was a mask of confidence, smug in a way that only someone who had long been accustomed to power could manage. He looked out across the courtroom, his gaze briefly meeting Jasmine's before he took his seat, as if to say, "This is where you belong, under my boot." But Jasmine didn't flinch. She sat tall, her posture unwavering, the calm in her demeanor a stark contrast to Paxton's swaggering arrogance. The moment he entered, the tension in the room escalated, the collective breath of the audience held in suspense. Jasmine's legal team was already poised for the fight ahead, ready to present their case, but she knew the real battle wasn't just in the courtroom. It was about making sure Paxton and his ilk could no longer operate with impunity, where a woman's voice was nothing more than a nuisance to be silenced. When the judge finally called for the proceedings to begin, Jasmine stood, her eyes focused and sharp, meeting Paxton's gaze without flinching. She knew exactly why they were here. This was not just about one tweet, one insult. It was about the abuse of power, the systemic silencing of those who dared to oppose the powerful. As she rose, the room went silent. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence commanded the space. We are here today because Ken Paxton doesn't just want to call me despicable. Jasmine's voice rang out, clear, steady, and unyielding. He wants every woman who dares to speak out against him or his agenda to be silenced. He wants us to shrink, to bow, to accept the demeaning label that he places on us simply for standing up and demanding respect. There was no hesitation in her words. Every syllable hit with the weight of the truth, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Jasmine's accusation wasn't just personal. It was universal. It wasn't just about the insult Paxton had thrown her way. It was about the countless women across the country who had been belittled, ignored, or worse, punished for daring to speak out against men like Paxton. She turned to face the judge now, but the room was still hanging on her every word, every movement. "This isn't just about me," she continued, her voice gaining strength, power, and clarity. "This is about the women who have been crushed under the weight of men like Paxton, who have used their positions to destroy lives, to silence anyone who dares to speak the truth." The courtroom seemed to lean in, as if the walls themselves were straining to hear. Jasmine didn't just have the law on her side, she had the moral high ground. And in this battle, it was the truth that was her fiercest weapon. Paxton's expression shifted slightly, the arrogance still evident. But now there was a flicker of something else. Uncertainty? Perhaps. He had underestimated her from the very beginning. And now Jasmine was standing here, using the very tools he had weaponized against others to dismantle his power, piece by piece. She held her ground, her gaze never wavering from Paxton as she made her case. This lawsuit isn't just about words. It's about exposing the truth. The truth about a man who has used his position to intimidate, to humiliate, and to destroy the lives of those who stand in his way. There it was, the truth, the spark that ignited the fire. Jasmine wasn't just taking him on in this courtroom. She was taking on a system that had long been allowed to operate without accountability, and today that was going to change. The tension in the courtroom reached a breaking point as Paxton shot back with a defiant sneer, his voice loud and insistent. "This is nothing but a cheap political stunt." His words echoed through the room, and for a moment it felt like the entire building held its breath. Paxton's response was calculated, crafted to undermine the legitimacy of Jasmine's lawsuit, to make her seem like a partisan pawn playing to the media. He looked across the courtroom, offering a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The arrogance in his tone was unmistakable, as though he believed this would be enough to shut Jasmine down. But Jasmine stood unshaken, her expression cool, her eyes locked on his as she absorbed the sting of his words. He had underestimated her, just like he'd done with everyone else who had ever dared to cross him. Paxton had made the mistake of thinking that she was just another opponent to be dismissed, another challenger to be ridiculed. What he didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that Jasmine was holding her trump card, a card that would change the course of this trial in an instant. As Paxton's smug grin stretched wider, Jasmine's mind flickered to the video, the one from years ago, buried in the depths of her files, a piece of evidence that would expose Paxton for exactly what he was. She had kept it hidden, waiting for the right moment. And now, that moment had come. "You think this is just a political stunt?" Jasmine's voice cut through the air like a blade. There was no anger in her words, just cold, unflinching certainty. She stepped forward, the eyes of everyone in the room following her every movement. Her calmness was the eye of the storm. "I don't play games like you, Paxton. This isn't about politics. This is about the truth, and you've been running from it for too long." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Paxton faltered for a fraction of a second, a twitch of doubt crossing his features. Jasmine could see it, the faintest crack in his armor, but he quickly recovered, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What are you getting at?" he snapped, trying to hold on to the control he thought he had. Jasmine smiled softly, a smile that never reached her eyes. "Oh, I think you know exactly what I'm getting at." She turned to her attorney, signaling him to bring up the file. Jasmine's lawyer, a seasoned litigator with a calm yet resolute demeanor, stood up. The tension in the air thickened as he turned to the judge, his voice smooth but firm. Your Honor, we have one last piece of evidence that I believe will put everything into perspective. He turned to the courtroom projector, clicking a button to display a video on the large screen. The room fell deathly quiet as the footage came to life. On the screen appeared a grainy recording, the timestamp reading 2020, as two men were heard speaking in low, conspiratorial tones. One of the voices was unmistakable, Ken Paxton himself, his arrogance dripping from every word. The other voice was that of a former assistant, someone who had long since left Paxton's office after facing pressure that most would consider unbearable. The recording revealed a conversation between the two, one that no one outside Paxton's inner circle had ever been meant to hear. The former assistant, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger, was heard saying, "I don't think I can do this anymore. I can't be part of this." And then Paxton's voice, cold and dismissive, cut through the air. "You think it's bad now? Wait until you see who I'm going to put in charge. It's nothing more than a joke. You see, it's a damn joke that some black woman—" He paused for a moment, as if the words he was about to say needed careful consideration. "Just got elected. It's despicable, like that black woman who got elected. She doesn't belong here." The room collectively gasped as the words sank in. The racial slur, the sheer contempt in Paxton's voice. It was all there, plain as day. Jasmine's jaw tightened as she stood up, her gaze never leaving the screen. The recording spoke volumes, each syllable a piercing accusation that Paxton's own words were the true reflection of his character. This wasn't just a slip-up, it was his true nature exposed. The shock was palpable. The audience was frozen, caught between disbelief and anger. Jasmine, standing tall, faced the judge and the courtroom with a quiet fire in her eyes. Her voice was steady as she addressed the room. "This is the man who holds the highest office of law in this state, and this is what he truly thinks of women like me. He doesn't see me as an equal. He doesn't see me as capable. He sees me as despicable." Paxton's face had drained of color. In that moment, the courtroom could feel the shift. The tide had turned completely. What was once an attempt to humiliate and belittle Jasmine had now become the very thing that would destroy Paxton's carefully constructed facade of righteousness. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no escaping it. Jasmine's hands were steady as she looked over at Paxton, now visibly shaken, his earlier bravado completely shattered. She had won, not just in court, but in the hearts and minds of everyone watching. The corrupt power he had used to oppress and demean others had now become his undoing, and there was nothing left for him but to face the consequences of his own words. The weight of the moment was unbearable. The courtroom, once filled with the hum of legal jargon and procedural formalities, had gone completely silent. All eyes were on the screen, on Paxton's face, which had gone from smug defiance to cold, stunned disbelief. The recorded words, those words that had once been private in the shadows of power, now hung in the air like a damning confession. Paxton, who had spent years wielding his influence in his office as tools of intimidation, had finally been exposed. For a brief moment, even the judge seemed to hesitate, unsure of how to proceed. Paxton's usual arrogance had dissolved, leaving nothing but vulnerability in its place. The judge cleared his throat, his voice sharp, breaking the silence like a hammer hitting glass. "We will adjourn for 30 minutes. We need to verify the authenticity of this video before we proceed any further." It was the right move, legally speaking, but in that instant, it felt like time had stopped. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Jasmine stood, her gaze never leaving Paxton, who was now shifting in his seat, his jaw clenched as he whispered to his attorneys. He was rattled, and it was unmistakable. This wasn't just about a lawsuit anymore. This was about the unraveling of everything he had built. Outside the courtroom, the world was already moving faster than the court could keep up. News outlets and reporters rushed to get the story out, feeding the public's hunger for the truth. Within minutes, Twitter exploded, a cascade of notifications flooding the screens of millions. Paxton Unmasked began trending as journalists, political commentators, and ordinary citizens flooded the platform with reactions, questions, and outrage. A storm was brewing, and there was no way Paxton could outrun it. Inside the courtroom, the recess did little to ease the growing pressure. Jasmine could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the weight of every eye on her. This wasn't just a victory in the courtroom. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced by Paxton's brand of intimidation. She stood firm, knowing that the real battle was now being fought outside these walls. As she stepped out of the courtroom briefly, her phone buzzed with messages from supporters, civil rights groups, and legal analysts. Everyone was watching. The world had just seen the man who had held Texas's legal power in his hands for so long, the man who had tried to crush her with a single insult, exposed for the world to see. And outside, in the echo of that 30-minute break, Jasmine knew something had changed irrevocably. This fight, which had once seemed like an uphill battle, now felt like a landslide turning in her favor. Paxton's shield of power, built on manipulation and fear, had been shattered, and there was no putting it back together again. The truth was out, and it was now the world's truth, not just hers. The courtroom fell into a profound silence as the four whistleblowers, figures who had once been silenced, discarded, and left to carry the weight of their truth alone, stepped forward. Jasmine's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the realization that this was the moment everything would change. These were the voices Paxton had tried to erase, the people who knew the inner workings of his office, the ones who had witnessed firsthand the corruption that had been hidden for so long. Their presence in the courtroom was not just a legal maneuver, it was the final act of defiance against a man who had built his career on lies and intimidation. And now they were here to expose the truth. As the first whistleblower took the stand, the room held its breath. The woman, once a key member of Paxton's team, now stood as a witness to the man who had destroyed her career simply because she had refused to turn a blind eye to the corruption around her. Her voice was steady, but every word she spoke seemed to carry the weight of years of suppressed anger and injustice. Ken Paxton thinks his reputation is a shield, something that can protect him no matter what he does. But the truth, the real truth, is a sword, and it doesn't matter how much power you have, it cuts through everything. There it was, the raw, unflinching truth. And for the first time, Paxton's mask of invincibility cracked. His earlier smugness faded, and for a brief moment, he looked almost vulnerable. The people who had been under his thumb, silenced by his power, were now speaking out, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, stunned by the sheer courage it took for these witnesses to stand up, to speak out after so many years of being crushed under Paxton's influence. The courtroom buzzed with a new energy. Jasmine stood, watching intently, knowing that this was her moment too. This was no longer just a defamation case. It was the chance to expose a system of power and corruption that had gone on unchecked for far too long. The floodgates had opened, and there was no turning back. The public's opinion was shifting, and they were beginning to see Paxton for who he truly was. A man who used his power not to serve the people, but to destroy those who threatened his dominance. Outside the courtroom, the news was spreading like wildfire. The whistleblowers' testimonies were being broadcast live, and the world was listening. Social media erupted with hashtags like "Wanna Sure Paxton Unmasked," "Near Justice for Jasmine," and "Expose the Corruption." People who had once been indifferent to the case were now on the edge of their seats, rallying behind Jasmine. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been wronged by Paxton's abuse of power. And it wasn't just the public who was paying attention. In the halls of power behind closed doors, lawmakers began to talk in hushed tones. Some had long been allies of Paxton, but the revelations in the courtroom were undeniable. Could Paxton survive this? What would happen if he lost the case? Rumors began to swirl about the possibility of him being forced to resign if he lost. Lawmakers who had once been loyal to him now began to question his future. His empire, built on lies and intimidation, was beginning to crumble before their eyes. Jasmine could feel the shift, the momentum swinging in her favor. The strength she had carried with her into this courtroom had now become the voice of countless others who had been silenced by Paxton's reign. She wasn't just standing in that room for her own justice. She was standing for every person, every woman, every activist who had ever been crushed by the weight of unchecked power. She was no longer just a congresswoman. She was the embodiment of hope for those who had none, the living proof that the truth could and would finally be heard. As the proceedings continued, Jasmine knew the fight wasn't over, but it was clear that the balance had shifted. The system Paxton had used to protect himself was breaking down, piece by piece, and with every word spoken by the whistleblowers, the truth became more and more inescapable. This was just the beginning, and Jasmine was determined to see it through to the end. Paxton's time was running out, and the fight for justice had only just begun. The gavel struck down with finality, its sharp echo reverberating through the courtroom, marking the end of an era of fear and intimidation. For a long moment, everything stood still, the room heavy with the weight of the decision. All eyes were on the judge, waiting for the words that would change everything. When he spoke, his voice was steady but full of gravity. After reviewing the evidence presented in this case, the court finds Ken Paxton guilty of defamation, having caused significant harm to the plaintiff's personal reputation and dignity. He paused, allowing the words to sink in. The defendant is hereby ordered to pay $1 million in damages to the plaintiff, Jasmine Crockett. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and for a fleeting moment, the courtroom seemed suspended in time. Ken Paxton's face went ashen, his jaw clenched tightly. He sat motionless, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only the hollow echo of a man who had believed himself untouchable. Jasmine, standing at the front of the room, didn't flinch. She had come this far with unwavering resolve, and now as the court ruled in her favor, she didn't need to celebrate. This moment wasn't about victory for her. It was about the vindication of every person who had been trampled by Paxton's abuse of power. Her heart beat steadily in her chest, her mind focused entirely on the path that had led her here. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about setting a precedent that would send a message to those in power, that no one, no matter how high up they were, could trample on others without consequence. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't raise her fists in triumph. She didn't need to. The court had spoken, and her actions had already proven her strength. As her attorney turned to her with a small nod, Jasmine remained calm, composed, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet satisfaction, not from the monetary victory, but from the truth finally being recognized. Then came the media rush, the chaos of reporters and cameras. They swarmed around her as she stood tall, unyielding, as if nothing in the world could touch her now. She turned toward the microphones, the flash of cameras a blur around her. Her voice when it came was calm, measured, cutting through the frenzy like a sharp blade. "I'm not here for money." Her words were simple, yet profound. "I'm here for justice. This isn't about a settlement or a paycheck. This is about making sure no one, especially women of color, ever has to endure the kind of harassment and humiliation I've faced at the hands of someone like Ken Paxton. He tried to break me. He tried to silence me. But the truth won." Her words were powerful, but there was no anger in her tone. It was the kind of quiet strength that only comes from knowing you've done what's right. She wasn't looking for applause or approval. She had already won what mattered. She had stood up, and now the world could see the truth about the man who had spent years wielding power with impunity. As she turned to walk away, the swarm of journalists continued to press forward, but Jasmine's steps never faltered. She was unshaken, resolute, and carried with her the weight of a journey she had completed not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been crushed by the weight of Paxton's power. The cameras continued to flash, the microphone still thrust in her direction, but Jasmine was already stepping into the sunlight, her face calm and determined. In that moment, as she walked away, Jasmine Crockett knew that this fight was bigger than any one individual. It was about dismantling a system of corruption, and now the world knew it too. The gavel had come down, but the storm was far from over. In the aftermath of the trial, as Paxton's guilty verdict and the $1 million fine settled in, the ripple effects were immediate and undeniable. The fallout was swift, and what had seemed like a powerful political dynasty began to crumble. Paxton's carefully constructed facade, built on years of political manipulation and calculated intimidation, was now exposed for all to see. The very man who had once stood as the unshakable symbol of Texas law had now been brought low, his reputation shattered. The public, the media, and the political landscape had turned against him, and there was no escaping the truth that now clung to him like a shadow. Whispers began in the halls of the Texas state capitol. It started with small murmurs from within his own party, from Republicans who had once been his staunchest allies. They were now questioning his ability to continue as the state's top law enforcement officer. The very officials who had for years allowed Paxton to wield unchecked power were now scrambling to protect their own political futures. Some of the more cautious members of the party were already calling for a meeting, a closed-door session where they could discuss the ramifications of the trial and the very real possibility that Paxton's time in office might be coming to an abrupt end. The tension within the Republican Party was palpable. These were the same people who had long turned a blind eye to Paxton's corruption, who had given him the benefit of the doubt for years, but now they could no longer ignore the truth. The weight of public opinion was undeniable, and the fallout from the trial was beginning to tarnish the entire party. If Paxton remained in office, it would only drag them down with him. Lawmakers who had once stood by him in the name of political loyalty now found themselves faced with an impossible choice: support the man who had led them for years, or sever ties and distance themselves from the scandal that had become his legacy. The stakes were higher than ever. Behind closed doors, Republican lawmakers convened a meeting that would ultimately decide Paxton's fate. The conversation was tense, with some calling for his immediate resignation, while others pushed for a thorough internal investigation. "We cannot afford to have this dragging on," one seasoned senator said, his voice grave. "The longer we keep him, the more it tarnishes all of us. It's time to make a decision, and it's time to make it fast." The pressure was mounting. Paxton had become a liability, and in politics, liabilities were often discarded. But the most powerful statement came from a small group of Paxton's former allies, who, once loyal to him through thick and thin, now spoke out openly. "The man we thought was invincible is no longer our leader," one of them declared. "We need to do what's right for the people of Texas, and that means facing the facts." The words struck like a hammer. Paxton, who had once been the king of Texas politics, now found himself on the verge of losing everything. Meanwhile, across the state, Jasmine Crockett's victory was being hailed as a moment of historic importance. Her victory, so much more than just a courtroom win, had reverberated throughout Texas, igniting discussions of justice, corruption, and accountability. She had stood against the tide of powerful men who had tried to destroy her, and now she had proven that the truth could never be silenced. The question on everyone's mind was no longer whether Paxton would survive this scandal, but how long could he continue to hold on to his position as Attorney General in the face of mounting pressure from every side? Paxton's political career, once thought unbreakable, was now hanging by a thread. The clock was ticking, and Paxton's fate was no longer in his hands. The pressure on Ken Paxton was mounting, suffocating in its intensity. His political allies, once loyal and unyielding, now began to distance themselves one by one. Behind the closed doors of the Texas Capitol, the whispers of his downfall grew louder. The tide had turned, and the question that had once seemed unthinkable was now unavoidable. Would Paxton's political career survive? It didn't take long for the answer to come. In a carefully orchestrated statement, Paxton announced he would not seek re-election next year. His voice, though steady, carried the unmistakable weight of defeat. "I have decided to step down from the race for Attorney General," Paxton declared, his words echoing across the airwaves. The statement was brief, calculated, but beneath the surface the message was clear. The man who had once seemed invincible was now abandoning the fight. The impact was immediate. News outlets exploded with breaking headlines. "Paxton announces he won't seek re-election after controversial lawsuit loss." The reaction from both sides of the aisle was swift and overwhelming. For Paxton, the walls had finally closed in. But the fallout wasn't just political, it was personal. The weight of the public humiliation was enough to drive him to retreat. But it wasn't just the court case that had crushed him. It was the realization that his empire was collapsing from within. Behind the scenes, Paxton's financial backers were also abandoning ship. The large donors who had once filled his campaign coffers were now pulling their support, the funds that had powered his rise to power suddenly disappearing. One by one, major Republican donors who had long been his financial lifeline began to issue statements about ceasing their contributions. Some cited the ongoing legal battles, while others were more direct, stating that Paxton's ability to lead had been compromised beyond repair. The money, the lifeblood of any political campaign, was drying up, and with it, his chances of any future in public office. As the media reported the withdrawal of several key financial backers, the truth hit hard. Paxton was no longer seen as a viable leader. The checks had stopped coming, and the door to the next election had slammed shut. What had once been a sea of loyal supporters now looked like an empty field, with only the remnants of a political career scattered on the ground. For Jasmine, this was more than just the fall of a man. It was the triumph of truth over power. The very forces that had tried to crush her were now being crushed by their own corruption. The donors who had funded Paxton's relentless pursuit of power, who had enabled his abuses, were now turning their backs on him, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Jasmine stood at the edge of this moment, watching it unfold with a quiet, unwavering resolve. This was justice, not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. Paxton had tried to break her. He had tried to humiliate her, but now he was being left in the ruins of his own making. The very people who had stood by him through thick and thin were now walking away, and all Jasmine had to do was stand tall, because she knew the truth had already won. The world had watched as Jasmine Crockett stood unwavering in the face of adversity, her courage pushing her through the storm of public attacks, legal battles, and the weight of a political system designed to crush her. But when the final gavel fell, and the courtroom erupted in a wave of disbelief and triumph, Jasmine knew this was more than just a personal victory. It was a victory for every person who had ever been silenced by the powerful. And soon the world would recognize just how far-reaching her impact had been. Within hours, the Texas Tribune dropped an exclusive headline that sent shockwaves through the state and beyond. Jasmine didn't just win, she changed the rules. The article, penned by one of the most respected political reporters in the region, dissected every twist and turn of the case that had now become a national symbol of justice. But it wasn't just the details of the lawsuit that caught the public's attention. It was the broader implications of Jasmine's victory. The article was a deep dive into how Jasmine Crockett had not only taken down one of Texas's most powerful figures, but had forced the establishment to acknowledge something they had long tried to ignore. That the rules of the game, rules that had been built to protect the corrupt and silence the truth, were no longer valid. Jasmine's victory, the piece argued, wasn't just about winning a lawsuit or humiliating a political foe. It was about shifting the very foundation of power in Texas. The writer detailed how Paxton, once a figurehead of Texas politics, had been dismantled piece by piece, not just by the legal process, but by the truth that Jasmine had dared to expose. Every piece of evidence, every whistleblower, every fact that had been buried under years of political manipulation, Jasmine had unearthed it, and in doing so, she had forced the public to see the rot beneath the surface. And now Paxton's political career lay in ruins, unable to recover from the avalanche of truth that had swept over him. But what truly set the article apart, what captured the essence of Jasmine's impact, were the reflections on what had changed in the broader scope of politics. The rules that had allowed corruption to thrive were now being questioned. And it was clear to everyone reading the article that Jasmine was not just a victim of the system. She had become the catalyst for its transformation. The Texas Tribune spoke of how her victory had inspired a new wave of political engagement, especially among women and marginalized communities who had long been excluded from the halls of power. She had proven that even the most entrenched figures could be taken down, not through force, but through truth and resilience. The reporter ended with a line that would resonate for years to come. Jasmine didn't just win her case. She gave Texas a new way of looking at power, and in doing so, she changed the rules of the game forever. The impact of those words lingered, hanging heavy in the air as the state of Texas came to grips with the fact that the status quo had been shattered. For Jasmine, it was a bittersweet moment. As she sat in her office reading the article, she knew this wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been beaten down by a system rigged against them. It was about the women, the minorities, the activists, the whistleblowers who had been crushed under the weight of corruption for years. Her victory had shown them that change was possible, that one person could fight back and win. But even as she allowed herself a moment to breathe, the reality of the future sank in. Jasmine had shifted the balance of power, but the fight was far from over. The rules had changed, but now it was up to everyone else to step forward, to keep pushing for justice, to hold the powerful accountable. Her victory had opened the door, and now it was up to the rest of us to walk through it. As Jasmine stood before the national conference, the weight of everything she had endured seemed to fall away. This moment was bigger than just a victory in the courtroom. It was a declaration that the fight for justice, for truth, would continue long after the gavel had fallen. She had faced down one of the most powerful men in Texas, endured every form of personal attack, and emerged not just unbroken, but stronger. Now she stood on the stage, not as the woman who had been defamed, but as the force that had shattered the system built to silence her. The applause that greeted her as she walked to the podium was deafening, but she stood still, her eyes scanning the crowd, her mind focused. The room fell silent as Jasmine took the microphone in her hand. Her voice, calm yet resolute, echoed through the vast hall. When someone calls you despicable, ask yourself, what do they fear most about you? Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth and defiance. The crowd shifted, some nodding in agreement, others leaning forward, waiting for the next word. Jasmine's gaze sharpened, her body radiating strength as she continued, her voice growing louder with every syllable. The truth, my friends, is what they fear. The truth has the power to tear down the walls they built to keep us silent. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. Jasmine wasn't just speaking to the people in the room. She was speaking to everyone who had ever been silenced, who had ever been told they were too much or too loud to be listened to. This was for every woman who had been told to stay quiet, to not rock the boat, to let the powerful hold the reins. Jasmine had lived that reality. She had been told she didn't belong, that her voice didn't matter. But here she was, standing on the largest stage in the country, a living testament to the fact that power could be broken by one person, one truth, and one act of defiance. Her speech turned towards the foundation of her mission, the fight for women's rights, women's dignity, and women's voices in a system that has long sought to silence them. Jasmine announced the creation of the Despicable Foundation, a legal fund to protect women who face political retaliation, harassment, and defamation. This foundation, Jasmine said, her voice growing steady and confident, will provide legal support for women who are targeted for standing up. We will make sure they don't have to face the same hurdles I did. We will give them the tools they need to fight back and to make sure their voices are heard, no matter how loud the opposition becomes. The crowd erupted in applause once more, but Jasmine stood still, her hands gripping the microphone, a fire burning behind her calm exterior. She had faced so much, been pushed so far, yet here she was, unbowed. This moment wasn't just about her. It was about every woman, every person who had been told to shrink, to be quiet, to stay in their place. With the Despicable Foundation, she was making sure that no woman would ever have to face that kind of injustice alone again. She was building a legacy, not just for herself, but for every woman who had been dismissed, devalued, and attacked. But Jasmine's fight wasn't over yet. Her next words were just as powerful, as they carried a message that would stick with everyone in the room and everyone who would hear it later. She raised her hand, steady and unwavering, and spoke directly to her audience. And now I have one last question for all of you. The room fell into a heavy silence, everyone leaning in, waiting for what she would say next. Would you stand up? Would you fight, not just for your own safety or comfort, but for the truth? For the people who have been silenced? Her voice was now raw with emotion, but there was an unmistakable steel edge to it. When your name, your reputation, and your career are on the line, when the very system that is supposed to protect you turns against you, will you still stand for what's right? Jasmine's words rippled through the room. It was a challenge, a call to arms, to everyone who had ever felt powerless or alone in the face of systemic oppression. She had already fought the fight most people couldn't imagine. She had taken on the political elite, the establishment, and come out victorious. And now she was asking the crowd, asking the world, whether they were ready to take on the fight alongside her. We can't wait for someone else to act. The change starts with us. We are the ones who will stand in the face of injustice and say, "This stops here." Her speech ended with a simple, powerful message. I'm not here because I wanted to be in the spotlight. I'm here because I believe in the power of truth, in the power of justice, and I believe that when we stand together, we can change the world. The applause that followed was deafening, but Jasmine was already stepping away from the podium. The fight was no longer just about her, it was about all of them. The people who had been overlooked, ignored, and oppressed. Jasmine had ignited a movement, and it was only the beginning. As the conference concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Jasmine made her way through the sea of reporters and cameras, her eyes focused and determined. She had already won the battle for her own dignity, but she knew the real work had just begun. With the foundation established, the fight for women's rights, for justice, for accountability would continue, relentless and unyielding. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman anymore. She was a symbol of change, a beacon of hope for those who thought they had no voice. And as she walked into the future, she knew this. The fight for justice was never just about one person. It was about all of us standing together, demanding change, and never backing down. Jasmine Crockett's victory in the courtroom was more than just a personal triumph. It was a statement that would echo far beyond that one case. It was the embodiment of resilience, of standing firm when the weight of systemic injustice tries to crush you. Jasmine had faced humiliation, threats, and a system designed to silence her. Yet she didn't just endure, she fought back and won. Her courage wasn't about seeking personal redemption. It was about giving a voice to the countless others who had been silenced by the powerful. The true lesson here is that justice isn't always handed to you on a silver platter. It's earned, often through sacrifice and pain, but most importantly, it's earned through unwavering commitment to the truth. Jasmine wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every woman, every marginalized group, and every person who had ever been told their voice didn't matter. What makes her story so powerful is the simple fact that she never backed down. She was called despicable for speaking out. But instead of cowering under the weight of that insult, she used it as fuel to push forward. Jasmine showed that no matter how much power someone holds, no matter how many people try to tear you down, the truth will always prevail if you have the courage to stand for it. Jasmine Crockett's fight was never just about winning a lawsuit. It was about changing the rules, proving that standing up for justice is worth the battle, no matter the cost. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.